The moment of insult and public humiliation was not just a passing incident, it was a wound carved deep in the presence of others, where silence was louder than words and stares were sharper than knives. It began with something that seemed so ordinary, a gathering of people in a setting where respect and equality should have been the foundation, but instead prejudice and arrogance colored the air. The man walked in with calmness, his presence quiet yet dignified, but the eyes that fell on him carried judgment before a single word was spoken. Some whispered, some sneered, and others openly dismissed him as if he did not belong, as if his worth was something that could be measured by appearances rather than achievements. The insult came suddenly, wrapped not only in words but in tone, a tone that dripped with superiority, that declared him lesser without hesitation. They questioned his right to be there, mocked his appearance, and laughed with the kind of cruelty that feeds on the silence of the crowd. In that moment, he stood alone, surrounded by people who found amusement in his discomfort, who believed they could strip away his dignity with careless remarks. The humiliation was not just in the words spoken, but in the audience that did nothing, in the way their laughter echoed like confirmation that he was out of place. For him, every second stretched into eternity, each chuckle, each side glance, each dismissive gesture felt like an attempt to erase his existence. He was made to feel small, not because he lacked stature or strength, but because others chose to see him through the narrow lens of prejudice. The sting of that insult was not just personal, it was symbolic, carrying the weight of generations who had endured similar wounds, unspoken yet deeply understood. Their words were meant to reduce him to nothing more than a target for ridicule, a spectacle for their entertainment, and in those moments it seemed as if the entire room had conspired to remind him of his supposed place. But beneath the surface of his stillness, his heart pounded not with shame, but with fire. He heard every insult clearly, each syllable searing into his memory, not as a defeat but as fuel. They believed their power rested in their ability to humiliate him, to break him publicly and leave him with no response. What they could not see was the quiet storm forming within him, the gathering of strength that comes when a man knows who he truly is, even if others cannot recognize it. The humiliation they tried to force upon him was met with a silence so deep it unsettled them, for silence is never emptiness, it is preparation. The scene carried an intensity that even those who laughed would later remember, because there was something unsettling in the way he did not react, something in the way his eyes held theirs without flinching, as though he was measuring them, weighing every action, every insult, every ounce of disrespect. They had insulted a man who had risen against odds, who had conquered challenges they could not imagine, and in their ignorance they treated him as though he were insignificant. The cruelty of their laughter, the arrogance of their dismissal, became the very stage upon which their downfall would soon be written. The public humiliation became a performance, one where they believed they were the actors in control, unaware that the man they mocked was silently writing a script of his own. He stood in the center of ridicule, and while they thought they had diminished him, in reality they had exposed themselves. Each insult they hurled revealed not his weakness, but their own shallowness, their inability to see greatness even when it stood before them. What they imagined was victory was in truth the beginning of their defeat, for no insult remains without consequence, and no public humiliation of a man of dignity goes unanswered forever. The hidden identity of the black CEO was like a carefully guarded secret that no one in that room had the ability to guess. To the outside eye, he appeared as an ordinary man, dressed with simplicity, carrying himself with calm restraint, blending into the background rather than standing out in the spotlight. There was no sign of the wealth he had accumulated, no flash of arrogance in his demeanor, no need to parade his success like a badge. His very nature was humility wrapped in quiet power, the kind of presence that only those who had built empires from nothing could carry. Yet the others, blinded by their assumptions, failed to recognize the truth that stood right before them. They looked at his skin, his clothes, his manner, and decided they already knew everything about him. Their arrogance made them think they could measure a man's worth by surface appearances, as if the value of a human being could be summed up in a glance. But what they did not know was that the man they mocked was the leader of a thriving company, a strategist whose decisions shaped industries, a visionary who had turned obstacles into stepping stones. They saw just a passenger, a guest, an outsider who did not belong, when in reality they were in the presence of someone whose story held more victories than their imaginations could grasp. This hidden identity was not an accident, nor was it weakness. He had chosen to walk without announcing himself, chosen to let his true self remain veiled until the right moment. He understood that real strength does not need to be shouted, it waits, it observes, it chooses the perfect time to reveal itself. He had been underestimated countless times before, and each time he used that underestimation as an advantage, watching silently as others revealed their true character. In that gathering, as they insulted and dismissed him, he carried the calm of someone who knew more than he was letting on, someone who held the kind of power that could shatter their arrogance when revealed. Every insult they spoke, every smirk they cast, deepened the divide between who they thought he was and who he truly was. They believed they were humiliating a man beneath them, while in truth they were exposing their ignorance in front of someone who could outmatch them in every way. This was the irony of his hidden identity. It gave them the rope to hang themselves, it gave them the illusion of superiority while in reality they were standing in the shadow of someone far greater. Their laughter became louder, their words bolder, because they assumed safety in ignorance, unaware that their cruelty was being recorded silently in the mind of a man who never forgot an insult. His hidden identity gave him a rare power, the power to watch people unmask themselves without interference. For when people think you are powerless, when they assume you are ordinary, they reveal parts of themselves they would have otherwise kept hidden. They show their arrogance, their cruelty, their lack of respect, and in doing so they hand over the very proof that will later be used against them. As they insulted him, he did not feel the need to correct them, he did not rush to declare his title, his wealth, his position. Instead, he let them believe what they wanted to believe, because he knew that the shock of truth is far more powerful when it arrives unannounced. The hidden identity of a man like him was not just about humility, it was strategy. He had learned through life that those who truly hold power never need to flaunt it. True power sits quietly, it studies, it waits. It does not compete with noise because it knows silence is stronger than shouting. In that moment, his silence carried more weight than their insults, because behind his calm exterior lived a mind that had built success out of hardship, a leader who had turned rejection into triumph, a CEO who had rewritten his destiny when the world tried to deny him one. To everyone in the room, he was just another man, someone they believed they could step over, someone whose presence could be dismissed without consequence. But his hidden identity was a shield and a sword at the same time, protecting him from their shallow judgment while preparing to strike back when the time was right. They did not know the kind of man they were dealing with, and that ignorance would soon become their undoing. The very thing they thought gave them power, his perceived ordinariness, was the illusion that would break them, because they had no idea of the storm they had awakened by insulting a man whose true self they could not even begin to imagine. Silent observation and controlled reaction are the marks of a person who understands the weight of patience and the power of timing. In that moment, when the insults were thrown and the humiliation poured onto him like a storm of arrogance, he did not raise his voice, he did not lash out, he did not allow anger to consume his composure. Instead, he watched. Every glance, every smirk, every whispered word became part of the scene he recorded in his mind with the precision of a strategist. He stood still while they believed their cruelty had silenced him, not realizing that his silence was not surrender, but preparation. Observation requires more strength than most realize. To stand in the center of humiliation and not react impulsively is not weakness, it is mastery over one's own emotions. He knew that anger, if unleashed too soon, would serve only as entertainment for those who sought to belittle him. So he chose the path of control, holding his head high, letting his calmness confuse them, letting his stillness create unease. Because the truth is, silence unsettles the arrogant more than resistance does. When they cannot provoke a reaction, they are forced to face the emptiness of their own actions. His eyes moved across the room, not with fear but with calculation. He studied each person, how they reacted to the insults, who joined in the laughter, who remained silent, who shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. He noticed details others would have overlooked, the way one man smirked as if enjoying the show, the way another crossed his arms to signal agreement, the way others avoided eye contact, unwilling to intervene but also unwilling to confront their own cowardice. Every expression, every movement was noted and stored. This was not just observation for survival, it was observation for justice. He would remember who stood against him and who betrayed him with silence. Controlled reaction is the art of turning restraint into power. While they assumed they had reduced him to silence, in reality, he was controlling the outcome by refusing to give them what they wanted. They wanted anger, they wanted a loud defense, they wanted to see him lose his composure so they could label him exactly as they had judged him to be. By denying them that satisfaction, he stripped their insults of their desired effect. His quietness became a mirror, reflecting their cruelty back at them, making them appear more foolish with every passing second. There was something deeply unsettling about his lack of visible response. People expect those who are insulted to either fight back or break down, but when neither happens, the aggressors are left exposed. His calm presence turned their laughter hollow, his steady gaze made their arrogance look shallow, and his refusal to react became its own form of power. In that moment, control was his weapon, and he wielded it with precision. Beneath that calm surface, his mind was not idle. He was thinking, planning, measuring the weight of the moment against the future. He knew that the right reaction was not in the present but in the unfolding of events yet to come. He reminded himself that true revenge is not in words shouted in anger but in actions that leave no room for denial. So he chose patience, because patience has a sharp edge, and when used wisely, it cuts deeper than any impulsive strike. He was also testing himself, for self-control in the face of public humiliation is not natural, it is earned. It comes from years of discipline, from lessons learned through struggle, from an understanding that life has always been a battlefield of perceptions. As a black man who had risen to the heights of a CEO, he had faced this kind of judgment before. He knew what it meant to be doubted, dismissed, underestimated, and he had long ago learned that the best answers are not given in the heat of anger but in the clarity of action. His silence was not new to him, it was a practiced strength, a weapon forged from experience. The room thought they had cornered him, but in reality, he had cornered them. Every insult they hurled without hesitation was a note added to the symphony he was composing in silence. Every mocking laugh was a drumbeat reminding him of the reckoning that would come. They thought they had stripped him of dignity, but what they had truly done was hand him the very material he needed to craft their downfall. He let them build their arrogance higher and higher, because he knew the fall would be harder when the truth was finally revealed. Controlled reaction also meant he did not allow himself to be defined by that moment. He did not let their words dictate who he was or what he carried within him. Instead, he carried himself as though their insults were beneath him, as though they were dust in the air not worthy of acknowledgement. And that posture, that self-respect, made him appear larger even in silence. The more he refused to break, the smaller they seemed, until their laughter began to lose its energy, replaced with a quiet confusion they could not admit to. His silent observation and controlled reaction created a tension that no one in the room could fully grasp at the time. They thought they had witnessed a man humiliated, when in fact they had just witnessed a man sharpen his resolve in real time. They thought they had silenced him, when in truth he was storing every word to use later with devastating precision. They thought they were in control, but control was his, hidden behind a calm expression and steady breath, waiting for the exact moment when patience would transform into power. Strategic setup for payback does not happen in anger, it happens in silence, with careful steps, with the kind of calculation that turns humiliation into fuel for a greater plan. After being insulted and dismissed, he did not rush toward revenge, he did not let the sting of their words drive him into reckless reaction. Instead, he stepped back into his own mind, a place where clarity replaced emotion and patience became the foundation of his response. Every move they made, every insult they delivered, had already written the outline of what was to come, and he was determined to let them trap themselves in the narrative they had created. Revenge, for him, was never about chaos, it was about precision. He had built his empire on decisions made with foresight, on strategies that turned disadvantages into opportunities, and this moment was no different. As he stood among those who believed they had broken his spirit, he began to design the very situation in which they would reveal their own weakness. He would not need to raise his voice or prove his worth through arguments. Instead, he would allow time and circumstance to align so that their downfall came from their own arrogance. This was the essence of strategy, making his enemies the architects of their own embarrassment. The setup began the moment he chose not to react. By remaining calm, he allowed them to grow comfortable in their cruelty, to underestimate him even further, to believe they had full control. In their eyes, he was insignificant, and that illusion was the first tool in his hands. People who underestimate you are the easiest to defeat, because they will never see your next move coming. Every smile he held back, every steady glance he gave, was part of the plan, because patience disarms even the most arrogant opponent. He knew that payback required the right stage, and he was willing to wait until the stage was his. He began preparing quietly, aligning the facts, the resources, the authority he possessed as a CEO, power that none of them could even imagine. While they mocked his presence, he thought of the ways he could turn their laughter into silence. While they spoke of him as if he were beneath them, he envisioned the moment when they would have to face the truth of who he was. The key was not just to respond, but to respond in such a way that the memory of it would never leave them. His revenge had to be unforgettable, not through anger but through undeniable revelation. Every insult became a reminder of what he would expose. He watched their behavior and allowed them to write their own judgment against themselves. They had mocked him without knowing his name, dismissed him without knowing his story, and in that ignorance they had handed him all the power he needed. The more they spoke, the more they buried themselves. All he had to do was wait, and waiting was something he had mastered long before this day. Strategic setup also meant he calculated the impact of timing. To reveal his identity too soon would have been to waste the power of the surprise. To wait too long would have been to lose the edge. The moment had to arrive when their arrogance was at its peak, when their sense of superiority had reached the point of no return. That was when the fall would be most devastating, when the silence that followed would be thick with shame. He understood that revenge is not just about action, it is about performance, and the most powerful performance is one that turns the stage against those who thought they owned it. As he moved through the aftermath of the insult, he carried himself with dignity, making sure not to reveal his intentions. He let them believe they had won, allowed them to feel secure in their mockery, because security breeds carelessness. They saw only what they wanted to see, a man out of place. But what they missed was the calculation in his eyes, the stillness that comes not from defeat but from design. His silence was not the silence of weakness, it was the silence of a builder constructing the foundation of their undoing. He was not plotting in anger, he was plotting with purpose. Every great victory he had achieved in life had come not from emotion but from clarity of thought, and this would be no different. He was determined to make this moment not only about his dignity but about a lesson that would echo far beyond the walls of that room. His payback had to be more than personal, it had to expose the truth about their arrogance, it had to shift the balance of respect, it had to remind them that dignity does not bow to prejudice. The setup was invisible to them, but it was alive in his mind. He planned the reveal with care, ensuring that when it came, it would not be a declaration of anger but a demonstration of truth. The most powerful revenge is the one that does not need explanation, the one where the facts themselves deliver the blow. He knew that when the moment came, he would not need to shout or argue. His very existence, revealed in its fullness, would be enough to silence the room. That was the brilliance of his strategy, not to fight on their terms, but to force them to face the undeniable weight of reality on his. The shocking revelation of true power hit the room like a sudden blackout in the middle of a performance, abrupt, disorienting, and impossible to ignore. What began as a murmur of curiosity swelled into a wave of stunned silence as the truth unfolded, not with the trumpet blasts of a man demanding recognition, but with the quiet, undeniable evidence of everything he had built. They expected a defense, a speech, a plea. Instead, they were given proof, names, accomplishments, facts that could not be laughed away, alliances and accomplishments that cast their mockery into an embarrassing, exposed light. In that moment their laughter died not because someone silenced them, but because reality had caught up with their assumptions and turned them into caricatures of themselves. Revelation is a theatrical thing when handled well. He chose to make it theatrical not through flamboyance but through context, a phone that pinged with an incoming message, a casual mention of a company few in that room had heard of, an offhand reference to a project that shifted entire neighborhoods. Each small detail was a stone placed on a scale that had, until then, been tilted by ignorance. As each stone settled, the balance shifted. Faces that had been animated with derision slackened into confusion. Eyes that had darted to one another for approval now searched for purchase on facts they had ignored. Their confident posture, the very stance that had fed their cruelty, melted into an awkward need for explanation. The power he revealed was not measured in the trappings of wealth, but in the authority of impact. He showed them patents, community programs, stories of employees lifted out of hardship, contracts that had turned failing ventures into thriving enterprises. He unveiled the quiet philanthropy that had changed the course of schools and health clinics, the mentorship programs that had launched careers, the policies he had influenced that now allowed others to stand where he had been forced to stand. Power, in his hands, was not a banner to wave, it was a ledger of change, a trail of outcomes. The shock came because their idea of power was shallow, applause, visibility, the loudest voice, whereas his was deep, structural, and therefore unassailable when presented as evidence rather than boast. The room struggled to reconcile two incompatible realities, the image they had constructed of him for the sake of their mockery, and the undeniable weight of what he actually was. Cognitive dissonance is noisy, it produces shifting glances, throat-clearing, attempts at humor that die on the tongue. Some tried to recover with small talk, a clumsy attempt to redirect attention, but the atmosphere had already been altered. Others grew sickly pale with recognition, as though the smoke of their judgment had revealed their own ignorance for the first time. The social hierarchy they had assumed to be natural suddenly looked like a fragile stage set, and they were left exposed in the wings. There was also a moral dimension to the revelation that hit harder than embarrassment. The people who had laughed did not merely lose face, they were confronted with the ethical weight of their actions. What had been a private indulgence in cruelty became a public record of behavior that required accountability. Some shifted in their seats with shame that felt authentic, a painful but necessary reaction. Others became defensive, grasping at excuses, rationalizing ignorance as if ignorance itself could absolve deliberate meanness. He watched all of it without gloating, because the point was not to revel in revenge but to unmask the assumptions that made such revenge necessary in the first place. Power revealed this way also rewrote relationships in an instant. Those who had treated him with contempt found themselves recalibrating their interactions, some with genuine apology, others with obsequiousness that tasted of opportunism. New alliances formed awkwardly, not from immediate friendship but from recognition that the social map had changed. People who had been invisible to him became painfully visible, and their responses varied, some learned, some doubled down, some fumbled toward repair. The dynamic of the room shifted from predator and prey to something more complex, a forced reckoning where past behavior demanded future correction. But the most striking aspect of the revelation was how it reframed dignity. He had not needed to shout his identity because dignity has a way of insisting upon itself when facts align with character. His reputation, built through years of consistent action, did what shouting could not, it made the mockery look petty and the mockers look small. Power, then, showed itself as a steward of respect, not as a weapon to crush. It commanded deference not by demanding it but by demonstrating the work and consequence that merited it. People felt that shift viscerally, respect settled into the room like a new, heavier atmosphere that could not be dispelled by previous arrogance. There were broader ripples beyond the immediate crowd. The revelation carried a lesson about assumptions and the social cost of misjudgment. It exposed how comfortable people can be in their stereotypes, how quickly they will construct narratives to fit prejudices, and how fragile those narratives are when confronted with truth. The incident became, for those who witnessed it honestly, an education, a live demonstration of how power and worth are too complex for casual dismissal, and how the social currency of mockery is unreliable when measured against substance. Even those who wished to minimize the moment found themselves changed in small ways. They would carry it like a cautionary tale, a memory that reshaped future behavior. The thought that one might be laughing at someone whose influence could one day be crucial is a humbling deterrent. For him, the revelation was not simply a victory, it was an assertion of identity so complete that it reoriented the room's moral compass. The shock was temporary, but its consequences, the rethinking, the apologies, the changed interactions, would last, because the truth he revealed could not be unimagined or unlearned. And as silence settled, the true measure of power was visible not in the hush itself but in what followed, the slow, inevitable reweaving of relationships around a new center of reality, the way respect began to be extended where ridicule had been given, and the way the lesson of that day would ripple outward into choices people would make from then on, choices shaped by the undeniable evidence that showed how wrong they had been to judge so quickly and so cruelly. The lasting lesson on respect and dignity was not confined to the room where the insult had taken place, nor was it limited to the individuals who had laughed, mocked, or remained silent. It was a lesson that extended far beyond that moment, shaping the way people thought, the way they interacted, and the way they understood the weight of their actions. Respect, once disregarded, cannot be reclaimed easily, and dignity, once challenged, has a way of teaching lessons that linger long after the event is over. What unfolded that day became a reference point, a silent reminder etched into memory, that respect is not optional and dignity is not negotiable. The people who had mocked him carried the burden of their own exposure. They had laughed at someone they believed to be powerless, only to discover that they had humiliated themselves instead. The image of their arrogance collapsing in the face of truth haunted them, a mirror they could not avoid. For some, it became a turning point, a moment that forced them to re-examine how they treated others, regardless of status, color, or appearance. For others, it was a scar, a mark of shame that reminded them of the consequences of careless cruelty. The lesson was clear: dignity does not belong to a title or position, it belongs to every human being, and the failure to recognize it comes at a cost. For the witnesses who had not joined in the insult but had remained silent, the event became a burden of reflection. Silence had been easier in the moment, safer than confrontation, but when truth emerged, their silence felt like complicity. They realized that respect is not simply about how one personally acts, but about whether one allows disrespect to stand unchallenged. They began to understand that by doing nothing, they had given permission to cruelty, and the discomfort of that realization stayed with them. It taught them that dignity is defended not only by those who own it but by those who witness it. The lesson also reached those outside the event, because stories of humiliation and revelation have a way of traveling. The narrative was retold in whispers, in conversations, in reflections, each time carrying with it the weight of a warning. It was no longer just about a CEO or a group of arrogant individuals, it became about the universal truth that respect should never be withheld based on assumptions. People began to speak about it as a cautionary tale, an example of why humility must accompany judgment and why appearances are never the whole story. On a deeper level, the event became a testament to the resilience of dignity. The man who had been insulted could have lashed out, could have matched cruelty with anger, but instead, he had chosen to let his truth speak louder than their arrogance. His patience, his controlled reaction, his strategic setup, and his eventual revelation created a narrative that proved dignity is strongest when it is not surrendered. By refusing to stoop to their level, he preserved not only his own respect but also redefined the meaning of power in that space. The lasting lesson, therefore, was not simply about his revenge but about the triumph of dignity over insult. For those who witnessed it, the story shifted how they measured strength. Before, strength might have been seen as the loudest voice, the harshest response, the ability to dominate in the moment. Afterward, strength was recognized in patience, in silence, in the ability to endure insult without losing composure, and in the choice to reveal truth at the right time. The lesson was that true strength is inseparable from dignity, and dignity itself commands respect in ways that force and arrogance never can. The ripple effect of the lesson touched the culture of the spaces those people moved in. Workplaces, gatherings, and communities were subtly altered by the reminder that arrogance carries risks. People who had once judged quickly began to pause, if only for a moment, to consider whether they were repeating the mistake of those who mocked the CEO. That pause was the lesson at work, reshaping behavior in small but significant ways. It encouraged humility, empathy, and awareness, even in people who had not been there to witness it firsthand. The lasting lesson was also about identity and pride. His experience showed that dignity is not granted by others, it is held within, unshaken by insult, unbroken by ignorance. The revelation of his identity as a CEO mattered, but what mattered more was that even before the revelation, he had never lost his sense of worth. The power of the story lay in proving that dignity exists before recognition, that respect is owed regardless of status, and that titles only amplify what should already have been acknowledged. The people who insulted him learned this lesson in the hardest way, and it branded itself into their understanding of others. Over time, the incident became less about humiliation and more about transformation. People began to carry the lesson with them into future interactions. Some used it to check their own biases, reminding themselves not to underestimate others. Some used it to teach their children the importance of respect. Others kept it quietly, as a private warning never to let arrogance blind them again. The man who had been insulted no longer needed to speak of it, because the lesson had taken on a life of its own. His story became a silent teacher, echoing through the lives of those who had witnessed it and those who had only heard of it. The lasting lesson on respect and dignity was, above all, a reminder of how quickly assumptions can crumble, how easily power can shift, and how deeply respect matters in every interaction. It showed that dignity cannot be stolen by insult, and that respect, when denied, will return to demand accountability in ways that can never be forgotten.